So let's make a start because we have slightly limited time always in these sessions. I'm Ben Crew, I'm a living in the department and the Deputy Director of the Prisons Research Centre. I'm really delighted to be hosting this evening and thank you all very much for coming, very welcome. I think the first very unexciting thing I have to do is tell you that if there is a fire alarm, it's a proper fire or a proper alarm. And you can either file out left, and you'll find a door on the left to go upstairs, or you turn right and you go up those stairs. Those formalities are over. And just to explain the way these seminars work, Kate, who I will introduce in a minute, will talk for about 40 minutes, I think. We'll then have around 15, maybe 20 minutes for questions, comments, and so on. Then everyone is welcome to stay for drinks and snacks, which are just outside here. So I will guide you there when the time comes. I am genuinely delighted to be introducing our guest, our speaker, Kate Gooch. Kate is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Bath. Previously, she has worked at the universities of Birmingham and Leicester. She is a very esteemed criminologist. She is on the editorial boards of the British Journal of Criminology, Incarceration and Theoretical Criminology, and previously on the board of the Prison Service Journal. And I think more importantly than that, Kate is one of the foremost prison scholars in the world, and by my estimates has spent more time on the prison landings speaking to staff and prisoners for the last few years than any other prison researcher I can think of. She really, really knows prisons well, and some of you will understand what I mean when I say that it is really genuinely hard work, proper graft, to spend that amount of time in penal institutions. Kate has published very widely on topics including the prisoner hierarchy, the drugs economy within prisons, temporary release, gangs, organised crime within prisons, the opening of new prisons, prison management, and most recently, prison violence. I meant to bring my copy of her book. I think Ruth has a copy which you should now hold up to show everyone. It's an excellent book, fantastic book called Prison Violence, Search for Recognition and Respect, published last year, and I really recommend it. It demonstrates Kate's skill as an ethnographer, her ability to really get beneath the skin of the prison, and also a kind of compassion and humanity that she brings. Kate is a visiting fellow here at the Institute, at the moment making the most of a 12-month Leverhulme fellowship that she was awarded. And the point of that award, I think, is to help her write up the study that she's going to talk about today, which is on prison homicide. One last thing I want to say is the fact that she was able to do this research also testifies to the degree to which she has built up trust and credibility with practitioners. I'm sure Kate will talk about this, but not a project to do, one that requires a good deal of institutionals. So welcome, Kate. I'll hand over to you, and I'll start waiting practically to go over time.
Thank you. I'm going to start. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present this evening. This evening, what I want to do is to touch on the role or absence of hope in prison homicide. So by way of introduction, I want to cast our minds a little further back to the Winter and others judgment before the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights, where as part what Winter and his colleagues were doing was trying to contest the legality of their whole life terms under Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, the court found in favour of them, and they were awarded damages initially. But one of the things that's interesting about the judgment is it refers to a right to hope. And this is where I want to start this evening. And this is what Judge Power Ford said in his concurring opinion, agreeing with the majority judgment. He says, hope is an important and constitutive aspect of the human person. Those who commit the most abhorrent and egregious of acts and who inflict untold suffering upon others, nevertheless retain their fundamental humanity and carry with themselves the capacity to change. Long and deserved though their prison sentences may be, they retain the right to hope that someday they may have atoned for their wrongs which they have committed. They ought not to be deprived entirely of such hope. To deny them the experience of hope would be to deny a fundamental aspect of their humanity, and to do that would be degrading. Now, the point about referring to the element of degradation is, of course, because that falls under Article 3 of the European Convention, which is enshrined in English law under the Human Rights Act. Now, the reason I start there is because Winter, Bamber and Moore were all contesting a whole life term. And there is some thought about whether or not that those who have no prospect of release might, in fact, have nothing to lose, and therefore be more likely to engage in certain forms of rule violations. Now, what I want to posit today is that actually that sense of hopelessness may be tied to the sentence, but may not always be around a whole life term. But actually the point about the hope or hopelessness can be really important in whether or not people move towards fatal or near fatal violence, or in fact suicide, or attempt both. Now, Josiah, one of my interviewees, one of the things he said is that there's more people getting sentences that they're never getting out from. Now, he wasn't necessarily referring to whole life terms, and this is something that I'll come back to throughout the lecture. The point he was trying to make was that even on a mandatory life sentence, you may still feel that you're never getting out. And that feeling of being stuck in the system, or the fact the system is never going to release you, is what can be a defining feature if other things in your inner or outer world feel unstable. Now, for context, I think this is important to understand why, and I'll touch on this a bit more in a moment, why we might be seeing more violence within the prison estate. There are other factors, but one of them is around people's sense of structural hopelessness. The extent to which their sentence or the way their sentence is executed or their time in prison is contributing to a sense of hopelessness. Now, the Prison Reform Trust recently released their Bromley briefings, and in it they note that the number of people serving life sentences has trebled in 30 years, and that the average minimum term is increasing. I think in the period that they cite, which is, I think, off the top of my head, roughly about a 20-year period, it moved from 13 years to 22 years as an average minimum term. But there are a large number of people now receiving minimum terms of 30, 40 years, even as young men, particularly men. But one of the things that's also important to note is that the number of unreleased lifers is increasing. The statistics for the last year show it's increased by 2%. The year before that showed the same increase. There is a problem of lifers being able to progress through a sentence and feel like they've got forward momentum. The other thing that's going to crop up quite a bit today is about the IPP sentence, imprisonment for public protection. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with this sentence, it was actually abolished in 2012, but we still have a number of people in custody who are post-Harrock, so they've served their minimum term, and are yet to be released. In fact, there are almost 1,000 prisoners who are yet to be released at all, even though the sentence was abolished in 2012. And it has been described as the greatest single stain on the criminal justice system. There has been some legislative change with the recent Victim Act, but arguably, to my mind, not enough. And this is going to recur as a theme as I talk today. So, when I talk about hope, I think it's important to say that hope is not always about release. There are some people for whom release may not be appropriate, and I say that with some trepidation. But I think one of my interviewees, when I said to him, "When will you desist from crime, or what might stop you reoffending?" he said, "Death." There are some people whose capacity for violence and sexual violence may never dissipate entirely. Now, we could probably have a separate debate about that, but what I want to make the point is sometimes we're talking about hope in a context where release is not the outcome. What they actually are looking for is meaningful connection with family, making a contribution, less secure conditions, being deselected from the close supervision centre that they might be held in, connections with nature. So some of the hopes that people talked of were just simply being able to walk around in fresh air, to touch grass, to see greenery. And actually for some of them, a calm mind and mental stability, free from intrusive voices and thoughts. So I want to say that I'm not a wild optimist, and I'm not necessarily sure that everybody can be safely managed in the community, or if they can, it might be in some years. But I do want to say that hope is an important quality, and as it's referred to in the judgment in Vinter versus the UK, it is an essential quality for the human condition and for the right execution of sentences. Now, when I'm talking about prison homicide, I think what's important to bear in mind is that we've seen an increase in homicide over the last 15 years. There was a point in the mid-2010s, particularly in 2015, which is highlighted, where we saw a peak of 8 homicides in 1 year. That was a notable shift, and our historic record around prison homicides is that each year there might be as few as 0, and sometimes 1 or 2 a year. So to have 8 was quite stark, and it never really came back down as far as we would like. And of course, if you notice the last 2 years, it has gone back up again to historic highs. And 2026 so far, we've had 2 homicides, one at High Point and one at Wakefield. So I'm not going to talk about this today, but there are perhaps ways we can explain some of this change in the number of prison homicides. But the United Nations went so far as to say that you're more at risk of homicide in prison than in the community in England and Wales today. Now, this goes against a backdrop of more violent and volatile and chaotic prisons. So although we're talking about homicide, we are also interested in attempted murders. And what we have seen over the last 25 years, this shows, is that actually the rate of serious prison violence has increased quite significantly and is on the increase. And again, there are probably reasons why it has increased from that 2013 point, and then again since 2021. So although there are a wealth of studies on prison violence, there is a paucity of research on prison homicide. In fact, over the last 50 years, there are only 9 studies published worldwide. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this work, and thanks go to the people in the room, you know who you are, who asked me to do the work. And grateful that they trusted me enough when I said, I think we need to interview people because all we know is what is based on quantitative studies. And what we can see already of the existing research is it tends to be very much focused on the importation deprivation debate, i.e. looking at factors of the individual, that would be the importation element, age, index offence, gang membership, or deprivation. But when we look at deprivation, it's largely focusing on features of the prison that we could measure, the age of the institution, overcrowding, etc. But it's left the narratives and perspectives of perpetrators very poorly understood. Now, there's very limited research on whether or not perpetrators in prison experience a sort of nothing to lose mentality or phenomenon. There is some earlier US research seeking to compare rule violations amongst those prisoners sentenced to LWOP, life without parole, with those who've been sentenced to life with parole, and actually found over time there was very little difference between the two. However, they only looked at the first 3 years. And what I'm going to suggest today is that actually the sense of having nothing to lose and being hopeless may actually be much later in the sentence. So although, as others have shown, including Ben, there can be a settling of lifers over time, and that the initial vertigo of being given a life sentence can diminish and people begin to make sense of it. What I want to show today is that actually if people feel like there is no hope, then actually that sense of having nothing to lose can emerge. And that can come not in the first 3 years, but as they approach tariff or are post-tariff. So for context for the people who are interested in methods, I'm not going to say too much about the methodological complications of doing this research or the demands of this research. But Ben is absolutely right when he says it took a lot of institutional support, because one of the things I did was interviewed people who had killed or tried to kill within prison. And those people are held in various parts of the prison estate. Today, I've interviewed 54 people, 32 had caused death, and 22 had tried to kill. And that was accompanied by some access to prison and probation ombudsman reports, and that was helpful in cases where the actual perpetrator had subsequently died and or been murdered themselves. And I'm about to begin an expansion of the study into the secure hospitals with some British Academy funding. One of the things that's going to be apparent very quickly is that prison homicide is a gendered problem. There are no women in this study, and this reflects broadly patterns of criminality in the community as well. Because of a particular cluster of homicides and suicides in one particular high security prison, this study also incorporates a detailed case study of one prison with Dr. Christina Straub. So, by way of overview, before I talk about the role or absence of hope, what I want to say is that prison homicide never has a single cause. There's often a plurality of reasons why people kill or try to kill others. And there can be a number of dimensions upon which their reasons for killing or trying to kill rest. So one of them, which Adrian Browns would be very keen to remind me about, is the role of mental illness and psychosis. A number of people were experiencing a psychotic episode or profound mental illness at the time they tried to kill or killed. It's a point I'll return to later, but the majority of the people I interviewed had spent some time in secure hospital, largely Broadmoor, Ashworth or Rampton, and had gone between prison custody and secure hospital. There is a moral dimension to why people kill. And when I say it's a moral dimension, I'm not saying that the murder or attempted murder was right, either legally or necessarily objectively viewed morally right from the view of an outsider. But actually, from the perspective of the perpetrators, sometimes they are governed by a sense of what is right to do in the circumstances. And for some of them, that was moral restoration. This was particularly present in the high security estate, where people worried that if they'd murdered a woman, they weren't going to be seen with the same esteem and social standing as someone had murdered a man. So in an attempt to resolve their shame about murdering women, had then gone on to kill or try and kill a man. There is a sense amongst some people of moral crusade, or as Katz would put it, righteous slaughter, and that can particularly be about targeting or punishing certain offenders. Now, one of the things that is quite clear quite quickly is that even though people sometimes assaulted very high-profile sexual offenders or people who had killed children, that was sometimes a pretext, or that was just a victim who they thought deserved to die, and it served as a useful opportunity for them. And so actually sometimes we can look at those offences and think that they only have killed because they're a sex offender or a high-profile child killer, but that can mask things. Some of these things I'm going to come back to in a moment, but desire and sensuality can be one. Some people enjoyed killing or trying to kill and inflicting pain on others, which is slightly horrifying in one sense. There's an economic dimension around death, controlling the economy or contract killings. There can be a relational dimension about interpersonal conflict. And there are, of course, institutional elements around the absence or quality of moral and social order, daily prison life, staff-prisoner relationships, use of power, and, of course, self-sharing, security and control measures. But as I'm going to come to today, there is a structural and system dimension. Now, one thing I do want to say as a slight trigger warning is that some of this content is quite distressing. And although I've taken out some of the more brutal details, actually sometimes reading the glib ways in which people can talk about how they feel about their victims or what they've done to their victims can be harrowing. So I just want to acknowledge that. and to say that if you do now want to leave, I will not at all be offended. But I'm assuming because you've come to a lecture on prison homicide, you might have been anticipating that. So I think one of the things to very much stress right now is that the people who kill or try to kill are very close to distress, and as close to distress as they are to cruelty. And those things sit together. They're as close to humanity as inhumanity. The desires that drive them to the inhumanity are common human conditions. The desire for hope, justice, respect, etc. And although when we look at a homicide, it's deeply personal, it's something that's happened between two or more people. It's also deeply social. It reflects something about the social structures and the social institutions and the social conditions and within which we confine people. So, very quickly, when I started interviewing, the nothing to lose idea was mentioned to me. So Alfie, who was an IPP prisoner post-Tariff at the time, he described what was happening for him at the time of the murder. And he says, in times when I'm hopeless or I don't care about anything, I can be violent. And when he was talking about what precipitated the homicide, he was describing that at the time, he felt like nothing mattered. You've got nothing to lose. And he says, I haven't got a child out there or family or friends, nothing, there's nothing. And this is the important thing, the consequences don't mean anything. It was irrelevant what sentence you give me, or you could have given me 20,000 life sentences. It doesn't mean anything, it's just a number. I'm not getting out anyway. There is something about, after a certain point, there's nothing more the state can do to you. If you never think you're getting out, people don't necessarily think that it matters to them if they're sitting in a segregation unit for a period of time. And most people, when they're killed, don't know of closed supervision centres, which might, of course, change for some people what they do, but actually, arguably, for some, it won't matter. And sometimes the volatility of being on a prison landing is less appealing than being in a closed supervision centre. Ishan said, again, talking about the absence of hope, the one thing I've learned from prison is you can't beat the system. And he says, they think to themselves there's no hope and they just want to rebel all the way. Jacob, who was convicted of a murder within prison, he was actually pre-Tariff, not post-Tariff, and he was a lifer. And he said, when I got that first life sentence, his mandatory life sentence, he said, I thought, I'm not getting out. Got my head around that. Excuse the language, they talk as they feel. So and he says, fuck it, it was what it is. No one's to blame but myself, just get on with it. He said, doing a 30-year tariff, they're never going to let me out anyway, so fuck it, got an out to lose. Now it is a very Yorkshire phrase, as I've come to understand from my husband. But what's also instructive is that hope can act as an anchor. And actually, for some people, so Liam was convicted of murder within prison, was given a life sentence. He was actually on a determinate sentence originally. He was quite a young guy at the time he murdered. And for him, he could foresee potentially being released. And he could see other people getting natural life sentences. And although he said, if someone threatens me, I'll kill them, and he was very honest about that capacity to do that, he also said, I don't, in fact, want to get a natural life term. So he also, on the flip side, hope can be a protective factor. One of the things that was quite striking quite quickly was, so Graham was an IPP post-Tariff prisoner. He'd actually done 11 years at this point, and he said, I've done nearly double my sentence. And he was just totally convinced that he was never getting out. And he said, when I got to my 11th year, I resigned. All right, then, I see lifers going home all the time. Well, I'm going to be a lifer and murder the guy I killed. Now, this is not the only reason why he murdered someone. But he said it proved a point for me to the system that I've been telling them for 2 years that this was going to happen, and they seemed to think I was a joke. So there is quite a profound sense of grandiosity in one sense, and a desire for respect and recognition. He had quite a significant mental health problem at the time. But there is also, as I said, about the plurality of meanings or dimensions upon which someone might act. Graham said when he chose the victim, he sort of chooses a sort of sense of righteousness. And he says it helped him, the victim, because he didn't have to deal with what he'd done anymore. They'd actually killed someone who was convicted of killing their child. And that person had been expressing some suicidal intent. And so that victim then became a relatively convenient way of justifying what Graham intended to do anyway. But one of the things I want to note is that of the 54 people, 7 people were IPP prisoners long post-Harry. Over a quarter of the people I interviewed were either IPP sentence post-Harry from mandatory life sentences, or whole life terms. So there is something that's functioning there. What I'm not going to say is that all IPP prisoners are at risk of killing. That is not the point. The point is something about what happens for people, how they interpret their treatment. Noah, on the other hand, wasn't IPP or post-Harry. He had a determinate sentence. But again, he said, I was hopeless all the way through it. And he chose a sex offender. And you'll see that he says, I was on a war footing, I was looking for a target, and he was the perfect excuse. And he says, every time I tried asking for help or trying to seek help, it just been thrown back in my face. I'm willing to change. Owen was 5 years past his tariff on a mandatory life sentence. And he says, I'd given up when I was up to nearly 20 years. And he says, that's why I agreed to the murder. I thought I ain't going anywhere anytime soon, so why not? I don't get why you want to lock someone up for 25 years, because all it's doing in a lot of cases is making people bitter, and then you will get an eruption at some point. I don't care who you are. You get lost in these places. By these places, he's talking about high security prisons, and that's when people lose hope. So there was a clear sense of hopelessness at the time. However, that wasn't the only factor or the primary reason he killed. At the time, he also described using drugs. He said, all I was thinking about was money, more drugs. I was getting sick of having to get drugs every day just to get through the day. And what happens is he hears that there is a contract on someone's head of 15 grand. He concocts a full story to move to the vulnerable prisoners wing where this person is held so that he can murder him. And he receives the payment for this murder. So there is some parallels between community homicides and prison homicides. And again, the victim was a sex offender, but that actually wasn't the primary reason he assaulted him. It was about the fact that he had this, he was struggling with his drug abuse, and there was the contract on his head, on the victim's head. Adam was a IPP post-tariff prisoner. And again, he reached a point where he just never thought the system was going to let him out. And he says, I've spent years and years in jail. I've done everything. I've done all the courses. I've done TSP, which is Thinking Skills Program. I've done anger management. I've done drug work. I've done a lot. And I went on a therapy unit as well, and I still couldn't get out. I couldn't even get to CAT C or CCAT. And first of all, he tried to kill a sex offender. Again, this was opportunistic. He chose someone who he thought that it was an excusable killing for. And what's striking is he said to me when he learned he'd survived, he said, I was gutted, I actually threw up. And then he tries to kill someone who he thought would kill him. So in some of the cases, there is an element of self-defense or a sense of kill or be killed. So I don't want to discount that from when I'm looking at hopelessness. And he said he would have got me. I knew he would. I knew he would have got me. So some of the hopelessness can come from the fact that I cannot get myself safe, or I feel like I'm out of choices here, and the only way to survive is to defend myself or actively, preemptively kill someone or attempt to. And when he was looking back, he says, I've done of it coming up to 2 years. So what he was saying is it was 2 years after he'd been sentenced. And he says, I've got some psychologists and that saying, oh, you can't lose hope and all that. And I said, listen, you're coming out with all this crap. I know that you're only trying to make me feel better, but they wouldn't let me out for one nicking. And what he means there is when he was going before the parole board as an IPP prisoner, essentially he'd had one nicking in a distant earlier in his sentence, and his perception was that they were using that as a reason to say he needed to remain in prison and be tested within prison. And because of that experience, he had largely concluded, well, I have now been involved in this homicidal incident, so what's the point in going before the parole board? They're not going to let me out now. He says, I'm a realist. Hope is a dangerous thing in prison. I've been through all that hope shit when I was doing an IPP, and I'm not going through it again. You know what I mean? Alistair was a mandatory life sentence prisoner, but he was actually pre-Tariff. He had quite a lot of shame for his index offence of murder, and he described a situation where he was experiencing very intrusive thoughts and voices telling him to kill someone. He said he described it as my head's fallen off. Sometimes you hear prisoners say, I was losing my head or my head was going, to refer to the way their mental health is declining. And when I asked him what was the lowest point, and he said it was leading up to the murder, and he says, I was telling them what was going on in my head. And he felt a degree of conflict because he knew if he told them what was in his head, i.e. about these thoughts of killing someone, that they were likely going to keep him in prison longer. But at the same time, he was moved by the need for help, psychiatric help in particular. And he goes on to say, I got to the point where I thought I had no option but to tell them to try and get help. That's when I talked to the prison staff. It means they did nothing. And actually, his psychosis at this point was quite profound. He said, I was sleeping. I was going 2-3 days sometimes without sleep. The staff didn't pick up on it. I handed my telly in because I thought it was a telly who was making me feel that way. As in, he was experiencing these auditory delusions and he thought they were coming from the television. All this, and they did nothing. They didn't even notice anything. So when the murders happened, everything went away. It was just like a big sense of relief. Now, I should say, I can't qualitatively, objectively test whether or not his sense that no one was doing anything was true, but what's important is his perception. And he described ruminating over a murder for months. There was a very long build-up point. And he said, in my head, somebody had to die because of the ruminations and thoughts I was having. The only way to stop it happening was to act on them. He deserved to die more than anyone else because he was in for rape against children. So when I say about this sort of moral crusade, sometimes it is just purely opportunistic and it is a pretext for what they want to do anyway. But he felt quite a profound sense of injustice about what had happened because he felt like he had done what he could to get help. And he said, I should never have been allowed to do what I do. And he felt pretty hopeless before his tariff, but when we were talking about his future, he said, I'm never getting out. He was a young guy who technically had the prospect of release. Now, I want to take us to a slightly different scenario, which is what happens if you don't have anything to lose, but you have something to gain, which is the flip side of nothing to lose. And I think there is something about acknowledging that for some people, there is a need, a desire, or a protest that is satisfied by homicide. I'm not saying that people are manipulative or instrumental necessarily, but and I wouldn't want to use those words, but to recognise sometimes there is when they're doing a cost-benefit analysis about whether or not to kill someone, there is more reward than there is loss. Joel was actually in a medium security prison, and he had a very difficult experience sitting in a sex offender treatment program. Now, this came up quite a few times in the interviews where people had heard other people describing their offences, either on a therapeutic community or in an offending behaviour program, and that had triggered for them quite profound memories of their own sexual abuse. Now, a couple of things all came together, really. One of them was he'd been on this program. He felt like he shouldn't have had to do this program because he was on a determined sentence, so was not compelled necessarily to do any programs before he was released. He was then in a single cell in a prison, but because of population pressures, his cell-sharing risk assessment was changed so that he could then share with the prisoner. And he was required to then share with someone who was a known sex offender and who would describe his offences to him in the cell at night. Now, Joel, on one hand, he is quite triggered, I think is the fair way to describe it, by hearing these accounts. But that's not the only reason why he acts the way he does. One reason is that he actually, at the time, he also raped the victim, not just murdered him. So there was an element of sexual satisfaction, primarily around power and control. But the other thing was that he described that when he was killing the victim, he was actually talking to his own abuser. So he said he was shouting out, "You can't hurt me anymore." And what he had in mind was the people who had sexually abused him as children, and that's who he was talking to. So there is what I would describe as a shadow effect, which is that sometimes when people are killing or trying to kill, it's actually a shadow of the abusive experiences they've had as children, where they're humiliated, ashamed, abused. And what happens in the murder or the attempted murder is that they're trying to be the overcomer and revenge or avenge their earlier abuse. One of the things I mentioned, desire and sensuality is one of the dimensions. So this sits alongside people who may feel hopeless, but also one of the consistent features of all the interviews is quite profound violence, abuse, neglect as children, and then sometimes as formative experiences within custody. It is telling that almost all the interviewees had experienced youth custody or custody as young adults, as adolescents. And those experiences have taught them that violence was the way to survive imprisonment. Now, Leo was an IPP prisoner. He was post-tariff at the time. In fact, he'd done he'd served 12 years on a 4-year tariff, so treble the amount of time. And he said he felt completely hopeless at the time. And he said, "I had nobody, I had no friends, I had no family, it's not a life. The most basic fucking form of existence. I just didn't care. I didn't see I had that much to lose. I was fairly certain I was going to kill myself anyway. And if I didn't, I had nothing worth living for anyway. So I didn't really see that I had anything to lose." Now, one of the things that is a feature of most of the interviewees' lives is also profound self-harm or suicide at some point in their lives. And for some people, that coincided in relatively short periods between the homicide and suicide. Now, he said, "I've tried very hard to stop myself from killing. I put myself in voluntary bang-up." What he means like that is that he'd kept himself to his cell. And he said, "I couldn't stop contemplating it." And he said, "I physically told wing staff, SOs, which is supervisory officers, the CM, custodial manager, and even the governor. And by that, he means the head of function." Now, I'm not going to attach as much weight as he wanted to this, because although he did tell people that he had intentions of killing someone, he didn't say who. And actually, that was quite important in what then happened. And again, there is a shadow event, because he killed a very high-profile sex offender. And he said, "I think when I killed him, psychologically speaking, I think that I was really attacking my childhood abusers. When I looked at him, I saw them." But I want to also acknowledge that he did actually want to kill someone. There was a sense of sensuality and desire. So these are people who are often quite traumatized, hurt, and as a consequence, there is a brutal distress or a cruel desire, that distress converts to cruelty and brutality. And similarly, Finley, he was at the opposite end. He was a mandatory life sentence prisoner who was pre-tariff. He had quite a few years to go and was relatively young. And Adrian Brown said to me, "Ask them what they lost by killing." And so I did. And he said, and it was an attempted murder, more than one. And I said, "What did you lose by trying to kill?" And he said, "Not actually killing him." And he says, "It's more the enjoyment of the kill for me. It brings a rush, gets your adrenaline going." And there was very much a sexual element to not actually the offence, but his enjoyment of the offence. But one of the things I just wanted to draw attention to was, he said at one point, "I just wanted to stop hurting myself." He wasn't actually self-harming, but what he meant was he was experiencing so much pain that this was the only way he knew how to resolve it. He couldn't countenance suicide, but what he was prepared to do was to be cruel to someone else. And he said, "I just wanted to stop being in so much pain and agony all the time." And both of them The incidents were precipitated by deteriorating mental health or a desire for a transfer to another prison, although that was only, as I've alluded to, one of several reasons. For time, I'm just going to skip us on to this point. Now, I've said that some people kill because they feel like they've got nothing to lose, and some people killed because they wanted greater clarity around the future, i.e. they wanted to know they were never going to get out. They wanted to stop having to jump through parole board hoops. They didn't want, and with Graham's case, he wanted to be a mandatory life sentence prisoner instead of an IPP prisoner. But I want to suggest that homicide can sometimes be self-harm as well. Because by killing or attempting to kill, some people have had such significant sentences added to them that they're now never going to be released because they got their natural or whole life term because of their murders within prison. And then other people were given such lengthy life sentences that the prospect of their release has dwindled quite significantly because they won't even be eligible for parole or consideration for parole into their late 60s, 70s or 80s. And some of these people are still only in their late 20s and 30s. So they've got a prospect of potentially 30, 40, 50 years in prison. And that's a very difficult length of time to sustain a sense of hope, momentum, progression or meaning in a sentence where you may not have very many people. So when I said that they sort of kill because they feel like the system's never going to let them out, the homicide means they aren't going to get let out, or the attempted murder may mean they never get out. So all the people I've just referred to, when we talked about what had happened since, this is what they said. So Adam says, I know I'm not getting out. There's nothing to look forward to. And he said, it's just a fucking concrete coffin. And some of them found it really difficult to think about death. One person said, I'd rather live in prison for the rest of eternity. And I think that was a sense of religious reality that to their mind, what death would mean would be hell. And for other people, death was something that they thought about quite a lot. And they thought about how they wanted to go. And they thought about when. Graham said, I won't get out. I've come to accept that I'll die in prison. I can't get out for an IPP. I'm already in for violence. I've murdered one in prison. And he said, trust me, Graham is dying in jail. Graham has got to accept that. Owen, there's no end in sight. I think that's a dangerous sentence to have. As much as I hate being here, I could go out of here and back to the close supervision centre, the CSC, like that. But if I end up back in CSC, I ain't ever going to get out of there again. Theo, so I won't be going out anyway. If you think too far ahead, you lose your mind. And Joel, he said they don't want to reduce my category. It's a dangerous game. I think what's blocking the light at the end of the tunnel is the system, and the system is so big and so tall and wide and broad and deep. The chances of ever seeing the light at the end of the tunnel are so slim. Now, I think this raises particular problems for practitioners because they now have to manage people who are hopeless before and hopeless because of the sentence, and for whom death is perhaps the only way out of the sentence because release is unlikely or unrealistic. But it is not easy maintaining the right sort of hope for people who think in the right circumstances that violence is a way to protest or have a voice. But one of the things I want to say is that actually sometimes the hopelessness comes from a feeling of injustice. It's not quite just about the sentence. So Malachi had originally been given a discretionary life sentence and felt totally hopeless. And the reason he was originally given his discretionary life sentence was because he had tried to kill someone at a point where he was very unwell. He was hearing voices. He basically was going to be discharged from a mental hospital and tried to kill to make sure he was not discharged from a secure hospital. He needed medical treatment. And so then attempts to kill someone and gets a discretionary life sentence. And it was a big sentence, as he puts it. But interestingly, he said, it sits so much comfortably with me than my other offence, because I can accept I deserve to be punished now. I deserve to be in prison. I can accept it. I still would rather be dead most days, but I can accept I'm here because I deserve to be. The first sentence, I don't know, I just didn't deserve it. Every year when I was hoping, getting my hopes up that I was going to go home, and it just breaks down. Every year I just wanted to get out and get back to normal. Whereas now I don't worry about parole. I don't have to please people. I don't put myself through that every year. I don't get my hopes up thinking I'm going home and then punched in the stomach and told no, and going through that all the time. It's horrible. I think a life sentence is the most inhumane thing in the world. I think every crime should have a set sentence. You know what you're doing and you aim for that. And if things go wrong in prison, you get time added on, but at least you've got hope. So by way of conclusion then, I think there is something about the correlation between unstable inner worlds combined with unstable outer worlds. And I think there is something about the way in which, because prisons have become more volatile and chaotic, there is a certain element of more violence as that outer world, the world of prisons, becomes more unstable, and there's less provision, there's less time out of cell, there's less mental health support. And actually, Zweli, who was not involved in any attempted homicide, he was actually one of the men in the high security prison. He asked me about what I thought about capital punishment, as in fact did some of the staff. And he said, it's either capital punishment or rehabilitation. They're trying this middle ground and it's not working. People are getting 25 to 30 years minimum. That's like capital punishment, but it's just filling up the prisons. They're taking away your life without actually taking it. They talk about rehabilitation, but I can't get out. I believe in capital punishment. This isn't rehabilitation. Now, one of the things I've drawn inspiration from a little bit when thinking about hope is a study by Mattingly, who interviewed and spent time with terminally ill children and their families. And she talks about the paradox of hope, how to maintain the right amount of hope when their child is inevitably going to die at some point, how to manage that hope. And she talks about clinicians, but I want to say that also about people who work in the prison system, how to maintain a hope, how to convey and regulate hope, how to give patients, in this case, how do you give prisoners a just right hope? Enough hope that they feel a sense of meaning in their lives and in their sentence, but without being unrealistic about the possibility of release, because some people simply won't be. How do you deal with denial? How to help patients find new things to hope for in their future, even without the possibility of medical care. And I think that translates in the sense of how to help prisoners find new things to hope for in their future without the possibility of release, or where release is a very distant prospect, 30, 40, 50 years in the future. So I haven't spent very long on this, but if anyone wants to ask me more about this in the questions and answer, there are some wider preventative strategies that I think would assist. But I guess to labour on one of them is there's something about replacing the empty time of imprisonment, and particularly life or long sentences, with meaning, purpose, and a real opportunity for change and a sense of forward momentum. Thank you very much.